The Discworld is a flat planet that rests on the backs of 4 huge elephants, which are in turn standing on the back of an enormous star turtle as it slowly swims through space. Now, if that sounds to you like an unlikely setting for entertaining tales of action and drama on a mythological and civilizational and very human scale, a deft, insightful exploration of political and social and cultural issues, a motley ragbag of memorable characters almost unparalleled in fiction, a potent mixture of humor and compassion with just the right amount of righteous anger, and a profound depth of feeling and experience that spans the entire spectrum of the human condition in a way that genuinely rivals the likes of Shakespeare and Dickens. Well, in that case, you need to read more Terry Pratchett. Welcome to the Politics of Fiction. I'm Darren. I look at literature through a political lens, and today we're talking about Men-at-Arms by Terry Pratchett. So I've got this nice hardcover version, but I have about 15 Discworld books, and I think I must have 4 or 5 different cover types. There seem to be dozens and dozens of different ones, but I really like these hardback ones. So I got into Terry Pratchett about 10 years ago, and he has become one of my favorite writers. Whenever I need a comfort read or something light, I normally reach for a Discworld book. They can be a real palate cleanser, and they'll always put a smile on your face. They have such a wonderful mix of humor and humanism, and they're full of kindness and hope, but not in an overly sentimental way. Fantasy as a genre, particularly the kind of whimsical fantasy that Pratchett wrote, is often dismissed by people who don't consider it real literature, maybe, whatever that means. And Pratchett himself actually spoke about this. One of my pet peeves, as it seems it was for him as well, is writers who refuse to admit that what they're writing is sci-fi or fantasy or speculative fiction, and instead they'll call it magical realism or literary fiction with speculative elements, which is up there with racially tinged comments as most annoying doublespeak in popular culture. I love sci-fi and fantasy, and I love a lot of classics, I love a lot of literary fiction, other genre fiction, poetry, drama, and so on. And I will be the first person to call out bad writing, bad politics, or whatever in a book. And look, there are some issues within fantasy writing, especially in some of the really commercially popular stuff, whether it's the shoddy prose or the reductive politics or whatever. And I will be talking about a number of those on the channel in the future. But every type of book, every genre, every microgenre has its good and bad. Literary fiction boasts some of the greatest books ever written, but it's also absolutely full of terrible authors who write awful, navel-gazing, pseudo-intellectual nonsense. But I have absolutely zero time for any writer or reader who just dismisses outright something as wide-ranging and worthwhile and full of artistic merit as fantasy fiction. I think it betrays an unforgivable level of ignorance and arrogance. Anyway, rant over. For now. So let's talk about the story briefly. Some of the Pratchett books that I've read have a pretty thin plot. It's often not the most important element of his books. But here, I think, we have a compelling mystery and a nicely paced narrative. This is the second book in the Watch series. These books follow the exploits of the City Watch, who are the police force of the city of Ankh-Morpork. And we focus particularly on the night shift of the Watch, known as the Night Watch. So in the novel, we follow a few Night Watch coppers pretty closely, including some new recruits, some diversity hires, which I guess is pretty topical at the moment, and they're trying to track down an assassin who's using a new type of weapon to kill all these powerful figures in order to bring about the return of the king, as it were. So the plot is good fun overall. There are some intriguing twists and turns and a nice drip feeding of clues, and there are some good set pieces towards the end. And I think the conclusion is pretty satisfying and everything is wrapped up quite nicely. In terms of the writing, Pratchett's prose is never going to be ornate ornate and literary. That's really not what he's going for. I think his writing is perfect for the kind of book this is. It's simple and always competent. He obviously has great comic timing and can structure jokes very well. And he writes a good action scene and very credible dialogue as well. He is very good at pastiche and parody and satire, at adopting certain voices and techniques and perspectives to mimic or send up various types of narrative. I think there is also kind of a technical excellence underlying everything, in much the same way as you can't play free-flowing jazz without being very competent at all of the fundamentals. It's always evident to me when I read Pratchett that he was very widely read, and that erudition really comes through, even with all the farce and the absurdity. And he will occasionally throw in a nice flourish of a beautiful descriptive image or some archaic vocabulary, or just a perfect one-line distillation of a concept, revealing a universal truth and making you go, huh, I never thought of it that way. In terms of the tone of the book, humour is the biggest aspect, obviously. Pratchett is very funny and the novel is full of humour. I like how he even uses the footnotes liberally to cram in extra jokes, extra ideas. What's more impressive is how the humour sits alongside and informs the characters, the themes, etc. As opposed to something a lot more one-dimensional, like say Douglas Adams, who just wrote books full of witty sentences. Pratchett displays quite a wide range of humour. There are some deliberately groan-inducing terrible puns, but then there's also some truly exceptional wordplay and esoteric references. There's pratfall, physical comedy, but also a really keen observational humour about human behaviour, society. There's an abundance of silliness and parody and subversion of pop culture tropes, but there's also a rich vein of rapier-sharp satire that can only come from a seething rage at the injustices of the world. His humour is always imbued with empathy as well as a desire to entertain. Now, humour is very subjective, and some people may just not vibe with Pratchett's sense of humour, and that's fine. But for me, it's all delivered with such warmth and self-awareness, and just the right combination of earnestness and cynicism that it's impossible not to love it. And there are some genuinely affecting moments too. This book has some very sad parts, but anytime the narrative risks getting too mawkish, Pratchett immediately diffuses that sentiment with humour. Like on the last page of the book, for example, where we have the escape of the scruffy little street dog Gaspode from the overbearing comforts of his new home. And it just means that you finish the book with a smile on your face, which is nice. Let's talk about the characters. This is where Pratchett really shines. Creating memorable, well-realized characters is definitely one of his strong points. Sam Vimes, who as we meet him here is the soon-to-retire captain of the Night Watch, is one of Discworld's best characters. A surly, world-weary cynic with a keen understanding of human nature and of his own faults and prejudices. Vimes knows that justice and fairness are rarer than they should be, and he does his bit to redress the balance. Not necessarily out of the goodness of his own heart, although there's some of that, but more out of annoyance that nobody else would do the job properly. His Boots theory of socioeconomic unfairness is a particular highlight of this book. So Vimes is a great character, but in Men-at-Arms he's not our primary focus. Instead, it's Corporal Carrot, who we spend a lot of time with and who drives a lot of the story. Carrot is an intriguing character, a human adopted by dwarfs, a huge man, full of presence and charisma. He seems unassuming at times, and yet he can command a room or a rambunctious crowd like no other. Unfailingly honest and ethical, a man of principles, and yet not without his own prejudices that he needs to outgrow. Carrot mentions in the book that the word policeman means man of the city, and that's very much what he is. He essentially acts as the city's conscience throughout. And I suppose in that way he could have been a very dull, moralizing character, but Pratchett manages to get a lot of fun out of Carrot's naivete and simplicity, and there are some really interesting points made through him about influence and power and so on, which we'll get to a bit later. And then we have the three new recruits into the Night Watch. Cuddy, the dwarf, Detritus, the troll, and Angua, the woman, and something else. All three are very well drawn, and we'll talk about them a bit more when we get into the themes of prejudice and diversity that Pratchett deals with. Discworld is right up there with classic Simpsons for the sheer breadth and quality of its cast of recurring minor characters. And we meet a few truly great ones in Men-at-Arms. We have the unscrupulous street food vendor, Cut Me Own Throat Dibbler. We have Gaspode the dog, who I mentioned. Death, the librarian, who's an orangutan, and one of my personal favourites, Corporal Nobby Nobbs, who was, of course, disqualified from the human race for shoving. Let's talk about world building. The thing I love about Discworld and Star Trek and a lot of the best sci-fi and fantasy is that despite its strangeness, it's also very real, very close to home. It's a world populated with dwarfs, trolls, witches, wizards, dragons, gods, and yet through these mythical beings, Pratchett expresses truths that are very human. The world has all the magic and wonder of the fantastical, along with all the strengths and weaknesses, the virtues and vices of the real. This is a world full of people at the end of the day. And Pratchett really fleshes out and gives life and texture and believability, not just to the individuals, but to the different groups as well. The book is full of lovely little touches of world building, like the reverence that dwarfs have for their tools, for example. And it's things like that that really add depth and resonance to all of the ensuing drama. So the world of this novel is the city of Ankh-Morpork. Here's a nice passage that we get about the city early in the novel. This is Ankh-Morpork, city of 1,000 surprises, according to the Guild of Merchants guidebook. What more need be said? A sprawling place, home to 1 million people, greatest of cities on the Discworld, located on either side of the River Ankh, a waterway so muddy that it looks as if it's flowing upside down. And visitors say, how does such a big city exist? What keeps it going? Since it's got a river you can chew, where does the drinking water come from? What is, in fact, the basis of its civic economy? How come it, against all probability, works? And this is a really key feature of Pratchett. This focus on the practicalities of cities and people and lives that are often omitted from other stories. It's not just the grandiose epic fantasy stuff that he's interested in, like the kings and the battles and the dragons. It's things like who delivers the post? How do the sewers work? Where do all the stray dogs go? And in this way, he really captures the gritty essence of life in a big, dirty city. The city essentially becomes its own character in the book. And we can imagine ourselves there, not just because it's well described physically, but because so much energy is put into showing us how it works and what goes on there at all levels. Discworld is one of the best realized worlds in all of fiction. And it's from this world that we get not only the action and the characters, but also the themes, the ideas, the politics. All sci-fi fantasy is explicitly political, because when you decide to create a world from nothing, you are necessarily taking a position on things like forms of government or crime and punishment, for example. Pratchett sets up the world of his novels in order to comment on systems and institutions in a way that is genuinely transgressive, looking at the world in an absurdist way that is also materialist, whimsical, but at the same time deadly serious. In Men-at-Arms, he critically examines concepts like monarchy, policing, prejudice, and many others. So let's get into some of that. Let's look first at the classic Spider-Man pairing of power and responsibility. So if we examine the power structure of the city, at the very top we have the patrician, Lord Vetinari, and he is an interesting character. He is not overtly authoritarian, but there is a suggestion that he might be capable of pretty much anything. In a lot of ways, he appears to be a more or less benevolent dictator type. Calculating, but not evil. He seems to mostly just want to keep things running smoothly and keep the people of the city content, or at least keep them from doing anything about their discontent. Carrot and Vimes have an interesting discussion about Vetinari when they're comparing him to the kings that the city used to have. The patrician is a supreme ruler, Carrot pointed out, but he doesn't wear a crown or sit on a throne, and he doesn't tell you it's right that he should rule, said Vimes. I hate the bastard, but he's honest. Honest like a corkscrew. There is a lot of talk in the novel about kings. The plot revolves around an aristocrat who wants to reinstate the monarchy. We also discover that it was one of Vimes' ancestors who killed the last king to rule in Ankh-Morpork. And Vimes himself is decidedly anti-monarchist. Here's what Vimes has to say about royalty. Royalty pollutes people's minds, boy. Honest men start bowing and bobbing just because someone's granddad was a bigger murdering bastard than theirs was. Listen, we probably had good kings, once, but kings breed other kings, and blood tells, and you end up with a bunch of arrogant, murdering bastards. So the major revelation that we get in the novel is that Carrot is the descendant of the last king, and therefore, in some people's view, he should be crowned. And this is where we see the idea of responsibility. So just like Vetinari, who knows that his position could be abused and that he could exert total control, but doesn't because of civic pride or practicality or whatever. Carrot, in turn, knows that he could never accept the crown. And it's not because he wouldn't be a good king that he rejects it, it's because he would be. Carrot is very aware of the influence that he has over people. He knows that he can make people do what he wants, but he also knows that he shouldn't do that. It's precisely because Carrot is suited to power that he doesn't want it. He knows that his reign would lend legitimacy to the institution of monarchy. And then all that has to happen is for one not so good king to come after him, and suddenly the city is at the mercy of a tyrant. Carrot knows that the city doesn't need a king in general, and it also doesn't need him as a king because he can do plenty of good in his current role, especially when he's smart enough to get what he wants from the patrician at the end of the book, when he successfully negotiates for an expanded watch. So monarchy is just one of the fallible institutions of power that we're presented with in the novel. We also have the guilds, like the Assassin's Guild and the Thieves Guild, for example. So we see in these groups that the city has codified and legalized organized crime. And again, we could see this system from the point of view of somebody like the patrician to be a practical way to achieve a balance of power in the city, so that no one group or individual can challenge his authority. The other major institution is of course the watch itself, but we'll get to that in a minute when we talk about policing. There is one more rather loose institution of power and influence that we're presented with, and that is the aristocracy. The main villain is an aristocrat who wants to bring back autocracy, and we see a few others like him through Vimes at his fiance's dinner parties. It's unclear in this book, at least, just how much power and influence the aristocrats wield in the city, but as we know from current events and history, the rich will always find ways to influence systems of power for their own benefit. There's a really nice cynical line from Vimes about power that I'll read just to finish off this point. So Carrot is essentially putting forward the case for righteous action, and he has this lovely Ursula Le Guin style line: "It's better to light a candle than curse the darkness." To which Vimes responds, "When has that ever been true? It's never been true. It's the kind of thing people without power say to make it all seem less bloody awful, but it's just words. It never makes any difference." I think I'm a bit torn here between Carrot's idealism and Vimes's realism. But of course, as any reader of Terry Pratchett will tell you, words are powerful things. And they can certainly make a difference, especially if they inspire people to act. Let's talk about prejudice and diversity. Ankh-Morpork is a diverse city and one that simmers with various tensions. There's a lot of prejudice when it comes to interspecies relations, which can obviously be read as analogous to racial relations. There's also a lot of discrimination when it comes to things like sex and class. So at the start of the novel, we meet 3 new members of the Watch who have been hired as part of kind of an affirmative action type program. And that's Cuddy, Detritus and Angua. So Vimes and many of the others are not too happy about this. They think that the Watch should be a place for men only. And we see a lot of prejudiced behaviour from members of the Watch. The worst offender is Quirk, who's the captain of the Day Watch. Vimes mentions that this guy doesn't know how to deal with dwarfs, that he calls them grit suckers. Am I allowed to say that? Then later, Quirk arrests a troll even when he knows he hasn't committed the crime in question. And he says he's a troll. He's guilty of something. They all are. And Nobby agrees with him. He says, yeah, he's bound to have done something. Even Carrot is guilty of prejudice at one point, remarking that he doesn't like the undead, zombies and ghouls and so on. So what is Samuel Vimes's attitude to all this? He says that he's not speciesist, but he does think that the Watch is a job for men. And there's this passage where he talks about the kind of overt discrimination that you might overhear at a dinner party full of aristocrats, for example. There were people who'd steal money from people. Fair enough, that was just theft. But there were people who, with one easy word, would steal the humanity from people. That was something else. The point was, well, he didn't like dwarfs and trolls, but he didn't like anyone very much. The point was that he moved in their company every day and he had a right to dislike them. The point was that no fat idiot had the right to say things like that. So Vimes is correct here in one sense. He's right that Quirk, for example, is a bigot and a horrible person. He's right that awful people will say awful things when they're safely ensconced among people of their own class. But he's also wrong. A lot of people will claim they're not racist because they don't go around shouting slurs at the top of their voice. Even if those people are racist in their beliefs, their actions, the way they treat people, the politicians and policies that they vote for, which means that they are racist. They're just slightly more insidiously racist. And Vimes, while not a horrible person, is most certainly speciesist, as he claims not to be, and I think he knows that. He does see trolls and dwarfs and other species as lesser in some way. Less capable, less deserving of holding certain positions, of having certain rights, etc. Now, Vimes does grow as a person over the course of the few Watch books that I've read, and like I said, he does seem to be aware of his own flaws and prejudices. I suppose in this book the main difference between him and Quirk, for example, is that Vimes mostly keeps his views to himself. He doesn't let his views interfere with how he treats the new recruits, or with how he conducts himself as a policeman in general. Or at least he tries not to. So let's talk about the new recruits. We'll talk about Cuddy and Detritus first, the dwarf and the troll. This interspecies enmity is one that runs throughout the entire novel, as well as both species being constantly denigrated by men and reduced to stereotypes. Here's a funny passage about the ill will between those two species. To understand why dwarfs and trolls don't like each other, you have to go back a long way. They get along like chalk and cheese. Very like chalk and cheese, really. One is organic, the other isn't, and also smells a bit cheesy. Dwarfs make a living by smashing up rocks with valuable minerals in them, and the silicon-based life form known as trolls are basically rocks with valuable minerals in them. In the wild, they also spend most of the daylight hours dormant, and that's not a situation a rock containing valuable minerals needs to be in when there are dwarfs around. And dwarfs hate trolls because after you've just found an interesting seam of valuable minerals, you don't like rocks that suddenly stand up and tear your arm off because you've just stuck a pickaxe in their ear. So we get this odd couple of Cuddy and Detritus teaming up as partners like a buddy cop movie. They start off bickering constantly and insulting each other. Then in the course of performing their duties together, they each recognize qualities in the other, and they end up respecting and even liking each other, and there's actually quite a sad ending to their story. So this is nothing really revolutionary from Pratchett. We've seen this type of story before, but it is done very well, and the message to take from it is that diversity is a strength, not a weakness. That the Watch and the City are stronger because they have such a wide range of individuals and groups and species and everything, who all bring different qualities and different perspectives. The other new recruit is Angua, and it's funny that some of the Watchmen think she's a diversity hire because of her sex, whereas others are aware of her secret. What I like about the treatment of Angua's concealment of her true identity is that it can be an allegory for any number of things. Pratchett may have just meant it as a feminist argument, and that definitely still holds up. Reading it now, you also can't help thinking of queer people or trans people, for example, who are so often subjected to open hostility simply because of who they are. And it's handled really sensitively by Pratchett. Angua never feels gimmicky as a character. She's well-rounded and likeable and realistic, and she's shown to be vulnerable, as we all are, but not weak, which I liked. So when you look at the points that Pratchett is making about acceptance and diversity, you might say, well, yeah, that's a bit trite, it's a bit obvious, everybody knows that. But when you look around at the state of the world and the creeping rise of racism and xenophobia and transphobia and everything, not to mention overt fascism, it's more important than ever to promote this kind of message about the importance of tolerance, cooperation, solidarity, community. We have to protect ourselves and one another and look after our own communities, because who else is going to do it? The cops? Let's talk about crime and policing. Owning 100 slum properties wasn't a crime, although living in one was, almost. Being an assassin, the guild never actually said so, but an important qualification was being the son or daughter of a gentleman, wasn't a crime. If you had enough money, you could hardly commit crimes at all. You just perpetrated amusing little peccadillos. This is a really interesting point. Not only do the rich and powerful routinely get away without being punished for their crimes, but often their crimes are not considered crimes at all. So what counts as a crime and what doesn't? What makes the news and what doesn't, where crime is concerned? When corporations and banks deliberately steal money from people, it's ignored. When wage theft is carried out by companies on an enormous scale, accounting for a majority of all theft in the world, it's ignored. When war crimes are committed by militaries in the service of Western hegemony, it's ignored. When crimes are committed daily by the police against citizens, it's ignored. And that's before we even get into things like Engels' concept of social murder. Millions of people every year are killed by things like poverty, homelessness, austerity, pollution, climate change, and a whole host of other things that are within the control of the governments of rich nations. And that's all ignored. But when somebody steals a packet of razor blades or some baby formula from a supermarket, stop the presses. The major news publications, the local papers, the news channels, they're all over it. Crime epidemic, crime wave, crime, crime, crime. And of course, in all of this breathless coverage, are there ever any questions asked about, whether people's material conditions might be contributing to this crime? Inequality, poverty, that kind of thing? No, sorry, the investigative journalism is down the hall. We just do moral panic here. Pratchett raises another good point when he talks about the patrician's view of crime and punishment. If there was crime, there should be punishment. If the specific criminal should be involved in the punishment process, then this was a happy accident. But if not, then any criminal would do. And since everyone was undoubtedly guilty of something, the net result was that, in general terms, justice was done. And this is essentially about the difference between justice and order. And authoritarian police states will always prioritize the latter over the former. We already talked about the prejudice of the individual cops, and Pratchett shows us the prejudice of the system as well. So many crimes are solved by a happy accident, by the random stopping of a car, by an overheard remark, by someone of the right nationality happening to be within 5 miles of the scene of the crime without an alibi. There's also a mention of the crime of lingering while being the wrong colour, shape, species or sex. So we have these mentions of racial profiling, of systemic injustice, and of the two-tiered nature of the legal system. We also have the very clear portrayal of individuals on the police force who cause material harm because of their bigotry, like Quirk, for example. Even Vimes is presented as not being wholly virtuous or anything. So in all of these ways, Pratchett doesn't shy away from showing us the real nature of cops and policing. However, I think there are also a few elements that are less realistic, mostly in terms of how characters are presented to us and the ethics of their role as police officers. For example, we get a line about how, from the point of view of the city, Vimes is not a good copper because he upsets important people. Now, how many of those kinds of cops are there, really? And of the few that there may be, how many of them can survive within the system while acting like that? Then we have the likes of Angua and particularly Carrot, both very decent, fair-minded, conscientious people, and they act with moral conviction throughout the book. And in Carrot's case, he actually manages to effect profound institutional change. Again, not very realistic. I would say that Carrot's whole ethos is completely at odds with reality. His pride in being part of the institution of policing, a man of the city, purveying this highly romanticized image of community policing, and its benefits on the recalcitrant populace of a sordid city of vice. So again, we're back to this simplistic portrayal of crime as being anything that is undesirable to the powerful people of the city, and something whose root causes, like poverty, aren't investigated or treated or even considered in any way by the rulers of the city or the police or the majority of comfortable middle-class citizens. So if we are to be discerning about this, as I'm sure Terry Pratchett would want us to be, given how much of his writing is about social justice and rotten institutions and so on, we should ask ourselves, what is the role of the Night Watch? To solve crimes? To prevent crime, to protect people? Those are the stated goals of all police forces, but we know that that's not the case. The police exist mostly to protect and to enforce, through violence, the status quo. So therefore, should we as readers be cheering for the cops? Should we want them to succeed? How much longer can authors credibly continue to present police officers as the good guys? I know that fantasy and all fiction requires a certain suspension of disbelief, but sometimes it's just too much to ask. Let's talk finally about technology and the influence it can have on a society. So there are other Discworld books that go into more detail on war and militarization and things like that. In Men-at-Arms, the martial technology at the heart of the book is much more personal. It's about the gun, or gon as it's spelt in the novel, and about the influence that a weapon like that can have on people. When the gun is stolen at the beginning of the novel, it seems to speak to the thief. So you might think, okay, this is obviously some magical cursed weapon that possesses people and makes them carry out its bidding. But we realize later that it's not. It's just a tool made by a mechanical genius. The voice isn't some arcane demonic presence, it's the voice of the person in possession of the gun. A voice telling you just how easy it is to pull the trigger in order to rid yourself of a problem or achieve your objectives. There's a line about how using a sword or a bow, for example, is just about channeling your own strength into the weapon. Whereas with a gun, There's no effort needed. It's so easy, just pull the trigger. And that way you can distance yourself from the murder that you're committing. There's a great scene at the end when Vimes picks up the gun and he gets that sensation of power. He wants to clean up the city, and with this, it would be so easy. And so he stands there, pointing the gun, listening to the clock chimes count down his tenure in the watch. And he is seriously considering sacrificing his entire moral code to use this instrument. And of course, it's Carrot who comes in and stops him. Carrot was one of the few who couldn't be corrupted by the crown, and he also won't be corrupted by the gun. And Carrot ends up smashing it to pieces and burying it. Now, obviously, this point by Pratchett doesn't even need to be taken to any metaphorical conclusion. It works in and of itself as a cautionary tale about gun control. But it also works for things like drone warfare. A bunch of soldiers sitting around a room with video game controllers, dealing out death on a screen dispassionately, clinically. And it should make us think about other tools that we use as well, ostensibly to facilitate our lives, whether that's smartphones or AI or whatever. There are some things that have the power to so fundamentally change our nature when we use them that it's worth thinking about whether we should use them at all. There's a line in the movie The Rock where Nicolas Cage says about a chemical weapon, it's one of those things we wish we could disinvent. And I wonder how much of our current technological progress, which is so encouraged and lauded, will be looked back on in the future with that very sentiment. Sometimes you just need to smash something to pieces and bury it. So that's it for Men at Arms by Terry Pratchett. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like more content, you can check out my Patreon, where 50% of my videos are going at the moment, and that number will increase. You can read about that on my Patreon page. There are already some videos up there about H.G. Wells, Mark Twain, Mary Shelley, Tom Clancy, so check that out if you'd like. And I'll see you back here again soon for another video. Take care of yourselves. Good luck.